Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I would like to welcome you to the sixth session and the last academic session. I also begin the session by thanking Professor Sami Aryan. I remember the first time he sent me an email where he sent the draft of the conference, and it was giving me all the names and all the different sessions. And now, alhamdulillah, right now, this became a reality and it is made possible. And I also want to thank to the staff who made possible this event. Amani Asanwar, Fadi Zetari, Uweis Khan, Dr. Muhammad Musa, Yunus Akdeniz. They all worked very hard in this center and they made this event possible. I also want to thank to our volunteer students who have been working very hard for the last couple of days. It's very important. Yes, today this session's title is Understanding the Fault Lines Within Muslim Societies, Within Muslim Ummah, and we will explore different cleavages, different problems that Muslim societies have been talking about. Professor Nader Hashemi will talk about the challenge of sectarianism. Heba Ezzat, Raouf Ezzat will talk about the challenge of ideological divide. And Professor Abdullah Al-Arian will talk about the challenge of nationalism. And finally, since Abdul Fattah al-Mahdi is sick, Mr. Darrag, the chairman of the Egyptian Institute for Strategic and Political Studies, will talk about the challenge of military-civilian relations. Without further ado, I just first want to invite Professor Heba Raouf Ezzat to the stage to give her talk about the challenge of ideological divide. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. Hello everybody, thank you for coming. I actually, when I saw the agenda of the conference, I decided to sort of include under my wider title of the challenge of the religious secular divide an approach that is much more sociological, if you can say so. Because we have talked a lot about the secular model and the Islamic model, and that this is the main challenge, especially when we think about government and we think about the state. We have attacked the Westphalian state and talked a bit about the post-Westphalian state and the situation in the Arab world. We have been talking like Nazih Ayubi, in Nazih Ayubi's language, talk about the fierce state, etc. But when we talk about the divide and ideology, actually we have not incorporated in many discussions what is going on in sociology and anthropology regarding redefining the secular, the post-secular age, etc. So my approach, because I don't have much time, would be actually to focus on the existential, spatial, and spherical dimension of secularism. So instead of just talking about the models in a theoretical way, I want to focus specifically, because this is a wide topic, on the spatial dimension. And I would ask clearly, and as I mentioned yesterday, I think that the urban divide is one of the most important dimensions of secularism that actually brings secularism into day-to-day life. So you wouldn't be able sometimes to explain to the average Muslim, whom we are talking to in very difficult terminology, to explain to him secularism like Al-Misiri, Abdullah al-Misiri talked about, Al-Almaniyya al-Juz'iyya wal-Almaniyya al-Shamila and these models and paradigms. But you can actually talk to him about the manifestation of secularism in day-to-day life. And this is a divide. And it's interesting that when the Muslim Brothers in 1928 established the Muslim Brothers, they didn't call it Al-Rabita, they didn't call it Al-Jam'iyya, they didn't call it Al-Mu'assasa, and they definitely did not call it Hizb. They call it Al-Jami'. And this notion, whether they were aware of it or not, is basically a way to sort of create a gated community in the theoretical sense. And this drove them gradually to feel that they are different. They talk about al-Jama'a al-Rabbaniya, Qiyadat al-Alam, what they call the Ustaziyat al-Alam. You know, it's interesting and it's very motivating in a time when the Ottoman Empire witnessed its decay, etc. But at the same time, there is a sociological dimension that has always been absent. You ask these questions so many decades later when you ask, what did they do to deserve the negligence of average people regarding what they are facing? Regardless of analyzing the situation in Egypt, this is not really my concern, because my concern is very theoretical, not political. But the question is theoretical. What happens? What happens to people? What happened during the 70s and 80s when, in my generation, people started, taking back the veil, and sometimes we had fights in our own families. I had a clash at school. It was not common. This was 78 when I took the veil. I was only 13, and this was like me and two others were the first case. For so many decades, this didn't exist in that school. So it was like manifestation of a desecularization process, but not in the theoretical sense, in day-to-day life. We reached the point where people were talking, researchers were talking about the Islamization of the public sphere, and a lot of research has been done, mostly by those who adhere to secular notions. So there was an inherent philosophical and paradigmatic bias, definitely. But this dimension of secularism was not incorporated in our understanding of the future of the Ummah, our macro analysis in a way. I will focus, because the secular is very wide, I will focus on the city. If we are saying that we want to re-establish Islamic civilization, again, and I teach at the Center for Institute of Alliance of Civilizations at Ibn Khaldoun University, civilization is a very broad concept, and usually professors of philosophy are the ones who teach the courses on approaches to the study of civilization, methodologies to the study of civilization. And when I teach these courses, I actually teach sociology, because civility and civilization emerge from the day-to-day life. I explain the city-state in Athens, for example, before we talk about the big ideas about democracy or about philosophy or about government. But you have to understand the existential, if we can say so, the spatial dimension of the city. And if you want to re-establish the Islamic civilization, what sort of a city are we imagining? How did it start in terms of the city-state, the small city-state of the Prophet? And why did Prophet Muhammad, when there was a Fath Mecca, it was logical that he would just go back and settle in Mecca? And this is an idea that Ziauddin Sardar discussed in his book on Mecca, which was very brilliant. He noticed that actually he didn't. It was expected, because when he went out of Mecca, he said, "You are the most dear city to my heart, and if your people did not force me to go out, I wouldn't have left you." So Khalas, Fath Mecca came and he should sort of go back home. He didn't. He went back to Medina. Why? Because Medina was the model of civility, and civilization is a big word. Civility brings us to the micro, to the how he dealt with women, non-Muslims, the spaces, the market, the masjid. See, this is how actually we can understand the process of creeping civilization, this creeping secularism in our day-to-day life. This divide between, sometimes in our own personal life, there is a divide. I don't want to talk about the very ideological. I've talked about it many times. The relation between the Islamists and the Marxists, the liberals and their betrayal of democratic values after 2013 and 2014 in the Arab world, in different countries, etc. But when we talk about the divide, it's actually there. It's in day-to-day life. It's interesting that yesterday, when we were talking about Sharia, and some tough questions were addressed to Jonathan Brown, and then someone said something like, "If you say so, you be a Protestant." Being the Islamic Protestantism or Protestant Islam or whatever. So it was referring to something a bit as if secularizing Islam, as if you give away the call for application of Sharia as a law, you are somehow, playing the game of Calvinizing Islam or Protestant Islam or whatever. And this was, for me, was very interesting, because it was also about the city. It was about reshaping the individual life of aspiration to achieve, not to think about delayed gratification. This is the notion that was manifested in people's lives. And I always reread again and again, and I teach this text by Heidegger, which is titled Building, Dwelling, and Thinking, where he, in a very short, very philosophical, very easy, very accessible language, talks about how building is very much related to dwelling. And the target of building cities and places and the architecture should reflect actually an architectonic vision of reality. And hence, there is no way that you can think about reviving Islamic civilization unless you ask the question of the urban. What type of a city do we want? And I think that on the theoretical level, and sometimes on the political level, sometimes on the level of social activism, Islamists, whether they were political groups or even individuals who were just, going back to their Islamic way of life and trying to desecularize their day-to-day practices, did not notice that they are living in a building that is not matching the dwelling according to Islamic phenomena, to the Islamic vision and perspective. And that's why yesterday I talked about the macro and the micro. It's very important to always, when we talk about Sharia, to think about the nature of community. And if this community should be able to receive Sharia, should be able to apply it, then sometimes secularism, as I call it, or as I name it, is cementing itself in cement, in buildings, so that you can change ideas. We had people who changed their ideas from Marxism to going back to adhering to the Islamic paradigm. We had the examples of Tariq al-Bishri, we have the examples of Abdullah al-Misiri, even Adil Hussein, who was working on the economic development dimension, Dr. Said Dessou'i in his work on development, etc. But very little was said about the city, about urban planning, about how secularization, and this is a challenge related to globalization and related to colonization, because all of that was not just a debate between ideas, it was actually a manifestation of planning and how our spaces were reshaped. So no matter how you want to become pious again, some structures in the urban space, the design of the city is immoral. It's not allowing you to practice your Islamic morality, and hence take Islam as a way of life, and then consider it as a frame of reference, and hence consider it as a way of dealing with matters of reconciliation, crisis, solving problems with your neighbors, with your relatives, etc. That's why custom, the customary dimension, is very much related to a community. You cannot establish urf as a source of understanding Islam unless you have a community that builds urf in the first place. And hence the infrastructure of the community itself has been reshaped by modern cities. And I think that this is the most serious challenge. You can change ideas by argumentation and discourse, but what would you do with such outskirts of Istanbul, of Cairo, that are actually not based at all on understanding the Islamic philosophy of dwelling? The first flat I lived in Cairo after getting married in 1991 was a building built, interestingly, by a company owned by an Islamist, and it was 15 stores, in each store 15 flats. And this was an eye-opener for me. This guy is a very, very pious person, and he believes in Islamic values, and he is very much supportive of the change of society towards becoming more Islamized, and everything. But he didn't realize he was a contractor, he was an engineer, and he was building projects, but there was no notion of what is the relation between building and dwelling. And hence, I couldn't be moral within this area, within this space. I couldn't reach out to my neighbors. We had 15 flats in the very same floor, and we had 15 floors. So it's like, I don't know the people in the elevator, and if I say good morning, salam alaikum, I just can't know who is sick, who can I just knock at the door and ask for help, or whom to expect to ask me for help. And the way of living has been secularized, and people don't notice that it's not enough to wear a veil or to put a sibha in your car or to ask your children to memorize Quran if they can't practice it. Going back to poverty, for example, in the last session, and how we are suffering from it, and the outskirts of the city, what we call ashwa'iyat, or the informal habitat, informal building, etc., there is an immoral dimension here, because when you have a family that is living in a room, in a flat with 3 families, and each family has 7 people, the father, the mother, 3 children, and the grandmother, and sometimes the divorced sister, and you have 1 toilet, how can you teach people haya? I mean, what does it mean? You know, they are queuing to go into the toilet with all the interesting smells, with all the interesting noises that everybody can hear since you start your day. What is morality here? What is ethics when you talk about it? You want to recapture the Islamic values and social norms, and it doesn't function. It doesn't function in such a city. So Zygmunt Bauman has a very interesting text. If we go from the micro to the macro, from the social to the political, it's titled Urban Wars. And he talks about destructive order and constructive chaos. And he says that actually the main promise of the state, when it established also the city, the modern city, is to maintain order. Order and security and law and, you know, development and institutions, etc. But we ended up in chaos. But it's ordered chaos. You don't notice it. You complain about the traffic. But look at how much the traffic in Istanbul and Cairo wastes time. And we couldn't solve it. I mean, it's obvious that the Turks are not able to solve the problem of traffic in Istanbul, and we haven't been able to do that in Cairo, where I come from, and obviously in other places, in Morocco and other cities. There is a structural problem in thinking about every time I go into a toilet in a hotel, in any Islamic city, I suffer performing wudu. I'm 52 years old man. I can't just bring my leg up there. The sink is very high, and it's broad, you know, because it's fancy. It's a big toilet, and it's just the person who designed it did not think that a woman who is 50 or a man who is 60 or 70 would need to raise his leg in order to perform wudu. How we dwell very much is related to how we build, how we design, and everything around us, not only the mobile phones, etc. Interestingly enough, one of the sociologists wrote an interesting book on even the virtual reality that is taking half of the life of the youth, because youth and women were mentioned in the previous session. And this is urban. The title of the book is Utopia. City, this is urban, but not as we know it. You know, this is an urban phenomena. The virtual reality is an urban phenomena because it's based on individualization, choice. It's based on your ability to go into and drop out of relations easily without any responsibility. The communities themselves, the bonds of communities are, look at your friends on Facebook. How many of them do you really know? How many of them did you really face-to-face meet? And you love them, and they might be good people in their own communities, and you exchange PDF books, you know. But at the end of the day, it's virtual. Look at the fatwa. I have a presentation in a conference in 10 days' time about the fatwa. From where I worked at Islam Online, when I had a problem with the fatwa section, because I was worried that the fatwa sent by email does not include adab al-mufti wal-mustafti. Yani what I learned, what I read as a young scholar, was that the fatwa is a process, and it's not only a process of legal dimension, it's a process of moral dimension. You go to the mufti, and you try to sneak and to ask half of the question, tell half of the truth, and he looks into your eyes and he tells you, so that's what your wife did, that's why you divorced her. And then you'd say, well, actually, I also hit her, and she complained to her father, and then the problem could not be solved, and then he says to you, okay, يعني أنت محتاج تتربي من أول وجديد, and هي كمان maybe she needs كمان شوية تربية, and come to me, we do some تزكية, you know, this is it. I mean, there is an adab. Sometimes you go from city to city to ask for a fatwa. There is a keen interest in faith. But now faith is a commodity. It's a commodity on the ask. You know the ask application? They send to shuyukh on the ask now, and the sheikh is making jokes because the medium allows him to joke. It's not a serious issue. In the fada'iyat, in the satellite TVs, this comes the sheikh, and someone is asking while sitting home, probably sitting home, putting his feet on the table in front of him, eating a sandwich, and then it's his turn on the microphone, and he says, عم الشيخ والنبي بس أنا كان عندي شوية فلوس, I had some money I wanted to invest. no respect, no sense of value of. This is transforming our understanding of religiosity, and it's transforming our practice of faith. And this is secularism. Patrick Hani wrote a book that was translated into Arabic, and I had the honor of introducing the book for the Arabic edition, for the Arabic translation. It's called Market Islam. How actually capitalism saw in the new movement of desecularization a potential market. So everyone knows in Cairo that we had new stores being opened to sell the abayas and the veils, etc. And at the American University in Cairo, my students, I tried to explain to them this market Islam, and then I noticed that 3 of them are wearing silk scarves that are Gucci or Western brand, and I told them this is not an Islamic veil, and they said no, it's covering, it's satir, yani there is tasattur in it and everything. I said to them, no, the philosophy of the veil is modesty, and if you buy your scarf for $200, $300, and you distinguish yourself by the brand from the average Muslim woman walking on the street, so that I can notice with your Gucci bag and with your Louis Vuitton whatever laptop bag and with your diamonds and with even your veil, then there's something wrong with that. And I think that the issue with the divide, it's not the divide on the theoretical level, it's the divide in this dimension. And also the divide in the city, of course, that nobody issued a fatwa that gated communities are haram. Actually, I'm not a fan of tahrim, I'm not a fan of saying haram and halal every 3 seconds, but if you have a philosophy of dwelling from an Islamic perspective, if you have a vision of an Islamic city that can accept the tanzil of the Quran and the ahkam, it's definitely not going to accept the values behind, or the notions behind a gated community. Definitely, you are separating yourself, you're seeking security. Okay, change the state apparatus to provide security for everyone. You don't create your own gated community, which is actually a gated community of power and wealth. So, can we have like an Islamic gated community with a section for women where they can have a covered piscine? How do you call it? A swimming pool, would this make it Islamic? I mean, what is the notion of our understanding of equality and justice and freedom and establishing a virtuous Islamic public good notion? If you don't realize that the spatial dimension, the material, architectural dimension is very important, it has been overwhelmingly neglected and overlooked by our thinking, our debates, and our projects, even when Islamists came to power. And I will be critical, okay? Look at the Muslim Brothers in Egypt, and look at the AKP in Istanbul. I don't see around Istanbul a vision of an Islamic city. I mean, I go to Başakşehir, where my university is based, and this can be anywhere. This can be Malaysia, this can be Singapore, this can be anywhere, except for the mosques. And the mosques are no more put on the hills. The skyline are buildings, not mosques. The mosques are in the bottom because you want to put the big buildings on the high land so that there would be a view. So you put the mosque, I will finish now. So it's the formation of the secular. I mean, let's go to the work of Talal Asad instead of going to the more theoretical works that are brilliant. I mean, the work of Al-Attas and others is brilliant, but it's a level of understanding the paradigm. But go, if you want to talk about reviving the Ummah, go to the day-to-day level and look at the formation of the secular and how it actually fosters itself in the details of our life, how secular we are. It's not a divide. The danger is the overlap. The danger is at tahrif. The danger is at tazwir of the model that goes unnoticed in day-to-day life. And I think this is a dimension. The city is very important to study, and global city, fundamentalist city, cities under siege, and the role of the armies in manipulating spaces of the city and ruling and creating these barriers. The new cities that are out of the old city to create a more safe space for the ruling elite, while the old city would not have worth anymore, politically or economically. Many problems are very much related to the secular, and I just wanted to highlight that. I don't have more time. I hope I put through a message that I'm very interested in. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ezzat, for this very stimulating talk. And right now I will invite Professor Nader Hashemi to the stage to give his talk about the challenge of sectarianism.
Okay, assalamu alaikum. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you to Sami Al-Arian for the invitation. I'm extremely happy to be out of Donald Trump's America for a few days. Topic that I'd like to speak about is the subject. What's that? He's still after me. He's after all of us. I'd like to speak about the topic of sectarianism or ta'ifiyya in the Muslim world, but I want to take 5 minutes to just address the broad theme of this conference, which is related to the current status and future prospects of the Muslim Ummah. Brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, friends, these are the dark days of Islam. We are in the midst, in my view, of the bleakest moment facing Muslim societies, marked by the ascendance of authoritarian and despotic regimes everywhere, and the crushing of pro-democratic movements in civil societies everywhere. One really has to reach deep into history to find a moment as dark as this. There's one event that recently happened that I think perfectly embodies the abysmal condition of the contemporary Ummah. And I want to share it with you, not as a way of depressing you, but I'm hoping it will inspire you to action. This event happened not too long ago, during the month of May of this year, on the eve of Ramadan, not far from the birthplace of the Prophet Muhammad. And you were all, I suspect, somewhat aware of it, although you may not have understood and appreciated the moral significance of this event. Less than 4 months ago, on May the 21st of this year, over 50 leaders from across the Muslim world gathered together to welcome, honor, celebrate, and pay respects to one man who traveled from the other side of the world to deliver a speech to the heads of state of the Muslim world. Of course, I'm referring to Donald Trump's visit to Saudi Arabia to participate in the Arab Islamic American Summit, his first foreign trip abroad after becoming president. Joining him on this trip were his closest advisors, members of his cabinet, prominent political and business leaders, and key members of his family. The leaders of the Muslim world rolled out the red carpet for Donald Trump. They gave him a hero's welcome. They danced together, they celebrated together. The country singer Toby Keith played music for them. They projected huge images of Trump's photo on buildings and billboards, and leading Islamic clerics blessed the event with statements invoking the authority of God and the legacy of the Prophet Muhammad. I'm not making this up. It actually happened. Now pause for a moment and appreciate the significance of this event and what it tells us about the contemporary plight of the Islamic Ummah. We are talking about the most rabid, anti-Muslim president in the history of the United States. Donald Trump campaigned for president on the platform of Islamophobia, xenophobia, and anti-Muslim bigotry that broke new records in terms of the promotion of hatred and demonization against Islam and American Muslims. He promised to create a database to monitor American Muslims. He promised to consider closing mosques. He openly called for the banning of all Syrian refugees coming into the United States because they're Muslim, and he said that he would not rule out, if the circumstances warranted, to do to American Muslims what was done to Japanese Americans during World War II. His close advisors, many of them have openly stated that Islam is not even a religion. It's a political ideology, implying that the rights of religious liberty that applies to other Americans do not apply to Muslims because they don't really have a religion. In Donald Trump's own words, I think Islam hates us, and I'm calling for the total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States, he said. And one of his first acts after becoming president was to issue this executive order calling for banning Muslims from 7 Muslim-majority countries from entering the United States. And every court that looked at this executive order found that it clearly violated the U.S. Constitution because there was a clear intent to discriminate against religion, Islam in particular. In other words, Donald Trump was condemned for Islamophobia, by the independent judiciary in the United States twice. And then rather than criticize him for his open and consistent anti-Muslim bigotry, the Secretary General of the World Muslim League said all of these statements and decisions by Donald Trump were not directed against Islam and Muslims, but they were really directed against extremists. Recall that during this trip, the leaders, to meet with the leaders of the Islamic world, Trump brought with him his closest advisors, many of whom are open and outspoken anti-Muslim bigots with close ties to the American Islamophobia industry. Steve Bannon, Sebastian Gorka, Stephen Miller were all there. And in fact, the speech that was written to speak to the heads of state of the Muslim world was written by one of the leaders of the Islamophobic industry with close ties to the Islamophobic industry, Stephen Miller. To my knowledge, not one Muslim leader had the decency, the courage, or the integrity to decline the invitation, to state that I'm not going to this conference because of Donald Trump's clear abuse and hatred for Muslims. No one issued a statement, no one repudiated it. No one said that it was ethically wrong to celebrate a man who has a long pattern of bigotry and racism against many groups, in particular Muslims. In fact, Muslim leaders, many of them did the exact opposite. They echoed the line from the White House that Trump was not anti-Muslim. He was really just trying to keep America safe from terrorists. Now, we know why Muslim leaders do these things. They do these things because they are more loyal to their political thrones than they are committed to any sense of Islamic ethics. That's clearly, I think, evident. Now, that's the state of the Muslim world, and I could list other depressing things that are happening, from the ongoing mass politicide in neighboring Syria, to the ongoing colonization of Palestine, to the massive humanitarian suffering in Yemen, to the depredations and horrors of ISIS, and finally, most recently, the ethnic cleansing and the persecution of the Rohingya Muslim minority in Myanmar. And this, of course, brings us to the question of sectarianism, because I think the rise of sectarianism, the killing of Muslims by Muslims, is a reflection of the deep crisis that we are passing through as an Islamic ummah. How did we get to this point of sectarianism? How can we make sense of it? Now, leading American politicians, leaders, politicians, analysts, journalists have sought to explain the current turmoil in the Middle East, in the Muslim world, by advancing this argument that there is this ancient sectarian blood feud that has always been raging in the Muslim world. And these conflicts were always just beneath the surface, but because of authoritarian strongmen, they have kept this problem under control. But now that because the authoritarian strongmen, their control has somehow weakened because of the Arab Spring, these essential alleged enduring conflicts between Sunnis and Shias have now risen to the top, and now we're seeing this problem. This is something, in other words, people such as Barack Obama and others have said is just an ongoing feature of the Islamic world. President Obama has several times mentioned the term ancient sectarian differences to explain the current turmoil and violence in the Middle East that, according to him, date back a millennia. I'm quoting him. Other American politicians in Congress, journalists have also made this case. Most recently, not too long ago, the prominent New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman famously claimed that, quote, the main issue in Yemen today is the 7th century struggle over who is the rightful heir of the Prophet Muhammad, Shiites or Sunnis. And sadly, some Muslims today, not knowing, I think, what's going on, have also fallen into this trap and believe that this is an ongoing, deep-rooted conflict in Muslim societies. Now, do any of these observations help us understand the question of sectarian conflict in the Muslim world today? The problem with the ancient sectarian hatred thesis is that it assumes something constant about religion and politics that is unchanging, and that it produces violence in ways that do not help explain the stark variation of civil conflict over time and in different geographies. In other words, the problem with the ancient sectarian hatred thesis is that it doesn't answer the question, why now? Why has sectarian conflict risen to such high levels today in the Middle East and not in times before? So just to cite one example, roughly 10 years ago, not that long ago, roughly 10 years ago, in a widely respected poll, it was revealed that in the Sunni Arab world, the two most popular politicians were Shia statesmen or political leaders. Hassan Nasrallah and Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. I don't think very much of those people, but in 2006, they were the most popular politicians in the Sunni Arab world. It was a time of conflict between Israel and Hezbollah. The rest of the Arab leaders had sort of taken a very, a weak position. They spoke out, and they were quite popular as a result of that. Now, in a book that I recently edited called Sectarianization, Mapping the New Politics of the Middle East, I challenge, and the co-authors of the book challenge this lazy Orientalist thesis on sectarianism that seeks to explain the turmoil and the conflict between Muslims today. And we propose the term sectarianization, an active process shaped by political actors operating within specific contexts, pursuing political goals that involve the deliberate mobilization of popular sentiments around religious identity markers. Class dynamics, fragile states, and geopolitical rivalries also shape the sectarianization process. The usual term sectarianism is typically devoid of such reference points. It tends to imply some sort of static, ongoing force that has always been there in the Arab and Islamic world from the 7th century until today, but that's false. Now, the theme of political authoritarianism is central to the sectarianization process. This form of political rule has long dominated the politics of the Muslim world, and its corrosive legacy has deeply corrupted the politics and societies of the region. Authoritarianism, and not theology, is the critical factor in the sectarianization process. Authoritarian regimes in the Middle East have deliberately manipulated sectarian identities in various ways as a strategy of deflecting demands for political change, perpetuating their own power at home, and projecting their power across the region. This anti-democratic political context is essential for understanding sectarian conflict in Muslim societies today. So to paraphrase from that famous statement from the Prussian general von Clausewitz, who once said that war is the continuation of politics by other means, in my reading, sectarian conflict in the Muslim world today is the perpetuation of political rule via sectarian mobilization. To make better sense of the sectarianization process, or the politics of sectarianization, there are different schools of thought that seek to explain ethno-religious mobilization: primordialism, instrumentalism, and constructivism. I won't bore you with the description of those schools of thought, but it's the constructivist school of thought, in short, that doesn't believe that ethnicity or religion in particular are inherently conflictual, but rather conflict flows from pathological social systems and political opportunity structures that breed conflict and exploit conflict in multiple social cleavages that are beyond the control of one particular individual or community. It's in this framework that I think we can understand sectarianism in the Muslim world today, and it becomes more intelligible. Sectarian identities could not be mobilized unless there were differences in beliefs and historic memory that propelled or compelled religious groups into collective action around particular identity markers. Two essential questions emerge. Why are these conflicts intensifying now, and why in some particular parts of the Muslim world but not in others? Sunni-Shi'a relations have not always been conflict-ridden, nor was sectarianism a strong political force in the modern politics of the Muslim world until relatively recently. How can we explain what's going on? The level of intensity of sectarian conflict also has geographic variation. What factors help explain this? While the role of religious leaders and political entrepreneurs is particularly salient in answering these questions, one of the contributors to our volume, Vali Nas, has made a specific argument that we need to examine the agency and the interest of state actors in the mobilization of sectarian identity. In the past, theories of religious conflict have generally treated the state as a passive actor in identity mobilization. The standard narrative holds that competition from within different contending groups would inevitably shift to the arena of the state as sub-state actors try to vie for control of the state institutions as a means of enhancing the power of their particular group. The intensification of this struggle will eventually lead to state collapse and state failure. But drawing upon research in South Asia and Southeast Asia, Nas has suggested that far from being a passive actor of identity mobilization, states in fact have a logic of their own and can be directly instrumental in manipulating the protagonists and entrenching identity cleavages. Identity mobilization here is rooted in the project of power acquisition by state actors, not necessarily in the behavior of societal elites or community actors. These state actors don't really champion the cause of any one particular community, but see political gain in the conflict between competing groups. Nas's insight helps understand our theoretical comprehension of the question of identity mobilization. And in this way, it pushes the conversation beyond the ancient ethnic hatred argument in terms of how religious identities can be deliberately politically mobilized and focusing on the level of the state and the interest of state actors. So let me just get to a conclusion. The key aim of the book that I've edited and the argument that I've been advancing is that sectarianism in and of itself fails to explain the current violence and disorder in the Middle East or in the Muslim world. This widely held view, based on alleged Sunni-Shi'a antagonisms that go deep into history, really confuses or clouds instead of illuminates the complex realities of the politics of this region that are better understood in the context of a series of developmental crises, both political and economic, that can be traced back at least into World War II. The politics of leading Western liberal democracies toward the Middle East have only exacerbated and made worse these developmental problems. While it's true that religious identities are more prominent in the politics of the Middle East today than before, it's also true that these identities have been deliberately politicized by state actors in pursuit of political gain. The politics of authoritarian regimes is the key context for understanding this problem. There's other dimensions to it, but I think the key engine that drives this process is the politics of authoritarian regimes. In other words, there's a symbiotic and deeply connected relationship between pressure from below in society, which demands greater inclusion from above, more respect, more representation, versus the refusal of ruling regimes and ruling elites from above to relinquish or share power. This produces a crisis of legitimacy that has to be carefully managed. The Arab Spring, I think, was one moment of crisis that illuminates this problem. The politics of sectarianism or sectarianization, the deliberate manipulation of religious identities, is the result of this political dynamic. Now, notwithstanding the rhetoric that we hear from some Sunni monarchies or presidents for life in the Middle East, in various republics, ruling elites are not really embedded to a particular sectarian identity. The driver of politics is not a defense of theological doctrine or loyalty to the collective interest of a religious sect. The core allegiance for ruling elites in the Muslim world is to their political thrones and their various clients, whether Sunni or Shia, who could help sustain them and advance their power. As one of the contributors in our book makes clear, sectarianism is not an inherent quality of the masses in the Arab and Islamic world. There are sectarian entrepreneurs, or businessmen, if you will, and religious scholars who continue to flourish in the present by manipulating these identities in the interest of ruling regimes and often at their request. Sectarianism, in other words, is a modern political phenomenon that is nourished by the persistent dictators whose rule depends on invoking these age-old identities that become lethally politicized when needed. In short, sectarianism does not explain the current turmoil in the Muslim world. Dictatorship does. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hashemi. And now I would like to meet Professor Arian.
So one of the advantages of being one of the last papers on the last panel is that, and of course, as I tend to do, is working on my paper until the very last minute, is to really benefit from the collective wisdom of many of the brilliant minds in this room. And so I'm very grateful for all of the other presenters and of course to our hosts for bringing us all here together to discuss these really important topics. And so I hope that I'll try to represent at least some of the things that we've been discussing and see if we can't try to bring some of these points and threads together as much as possible. But I'm sure that my fellow panelists would agree with me that we have a major challenge in trying to talk about these topics in just one paper or even one session. I mean, you could do an entire conference just on the question of Islam and secularism, or Islam and the challenge of sectarianization, or in my case, the challenge of nationalism. So what I'm going to try to do is to really just limit my comments to assessing the question of nationalism primarily from the perspective of the only actors that continue to actually consider it a challenge, the last holdouts, as it were, to the rise of nation states, and that would be the Islamists. So in the time that I have, what I plan to do is explore how the perception of nationalism has evolved over time from a phenomenon considered to pose an existential threat to the integrity of the Ummah, the global community of Muslims, to one that has been largely integrated into the activist mission of the majority of Islamist movements across the Middle East and North Africa regions. So what I argue is that many contemporary analyses that continue to pit Islamism and nationalism on opposing ends of a spectrum of political ideologies are largely outdated, or they suffer from sweeping generalizations that fail to distinguish between particular modes of Islamic activism, with only a minority that continues to actually express opposition to nationalism as a force of political and social organization. So part of the problem with the way that this question is handled is the tendency to assume static definitions of the concepts in question, without taking into account the historical context for the emergence and development of the various forms of nationalism, and in turn, the Islamic responses to them. We're left with an impression that this has been an ongoing struggle between the same two forces for the past 200 years. Rather than viewing nationalism simply as a modern European concept without the proper antecedent in classical Islamic political thought to pave the way for its entry into modern Muslim societies, I think it'd be more fitting to examine it in relation to the power hierarchies that are at work between 19th century empires. So if the responses across the Muslim empires are any indication, the concerns with the spread of European-style nationalism was not so much that it was seen as an affront to notions of historical Islamic unity, than it was about the fact that European empires exploited nationalist expressions on the part of minority groups within the Ottoman Empire in order to establish a greater degree of political and economic influence while undermining the sovereignty of the empire. This was particularly true of the Greek revolt during the earlier part of the century, an event which continued to loom large over subsequent expressions of nationalism that were interpreted as imperial attempts to subvert and then eventually dismember the Ottoman Empire. Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani, viewed as one of the originators of the Islamic modernist movement, was also one of the most prominent critics of European imperialism in his day. He promoted a political response to Western encroachment grounded in the reassertion of Islamic values, eventually articulating what would come to be known, of course, as pan-Islamism, that is, the need to unite Muslim populations in the face of this external threat that they faced. Pan-Islamism was eventually adopted as an ideological project guiding the Ottoman Empire and its ruling elites during the reign of Sultan Abdulhamid II. It was viewed largely as an attempt to balance the rising tide of nationalist claims by the empire's non-Muslim populations by appealing to Muslim populations outside of the empire and uniting those who remained within its borders, but had also begun to express political grievances along ethnic and cultural lines. But I think it's worth questioning whether the characterization of pan-Islamism as an anti-nationalist project is true. While it may have attempted to stem the tide of growing nationalist agitation, pan-Islamism was also a form of nationalist expression in that it packaged a set of common cultural identifiers within which to legitimize attempts to govern a population within a bounded territory. In fact, al-Afghani's legacy defies the narrative that views Pan-Islamism as requiring political unity of all Muslims in every place. He famously traveled through many different empires, attempting to influence the rulers of Egypt, Qajar, Iran, and the Ottoman Empire. And while in India, he wrote favorably of the nationalist aspirations of Indian Muslims and Hindus in their struggle against British imperialism, and made no reference to a broader union among Indians, Muslims, and those elsewhere. In Egypt, he supported, of course, the revolt led by Colonel Ahmed Arabi under the banner of Egypt for the Egyptians. So if the Islamic modernists believed that Muslim unity was an ideal that nevertheless allowed for Muslims to act locally on the basis of their geographic, cultural, and linguistic solidarities, they would soon also come to accept the fact that these national identities would become territorially bounded within states. Muhammad Abdu, Afghani's leading disciple, and the prominent modernist reformer, was a supporter also of the Arabi revolt, for which, of course, he was promptly exiled. He also devoted the final years of his life as the Mufti of Egypt to the standardization of the Egyptian legal code to be in keeping with the demands of the modern state. But when we follow the thread of Abdu's disciples, scholars generally place them in one of two categories: secular nationalists and Islamic reformers. On one side, of course, we have people like Saad Zaghlul, the leaders of the Weft Party, who envisioned an independent Egypt freed from British imperialism, with a liberal parliament, a constitutional monarchy, and they relied on Abdu's reformist ideas to free the nationalist movement from the shackles of religious traditionalism to construct a new mode of political and social order. Other liberal nationalisms around the rest of the Arab world emerged during the same time, doing largely the same thing, employing these same kinds of methods. But on the other side, we see a narrative that develops around the more conservative voices who welcomed Abdu's call to return to the original sources of Islam, but did so in order to challenge the encroachment of European hegemony in the attempts to refashion state institutions in a way that was seen to undermine traditional Islamic institutions. So because of these critiques, has been characterized as a critic of the nationalist movement. But once again, I'd caution against adhering to that kind of reading. Just 2 decades after Abdu's death, Rida was confronting a new reality: the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in war, the formalization of European claims to Arab lands, and then the territorial division of those lands along lines that suited colonial interests, and ultimately, of course, the collapse of the caliphate. So in the face of these challenges, Rida made appeals for the preservation of the territorial integrity of the Ottoman Empire's Arab lands and for the continuation of the caliphate. But at the same time, he increasingly recognized that challenges to imperialism were being organized along nationalist lines. And so in one issue of Al-Manar, he writes that, quote, "The contemporary notion of patriotism expresses the unity of the people of different religions in their homeland and their cooperation in defending the homeland that they share. They cooperate to preserve its independence, to win it back if it was lost, and to develop it. The type of patriotism that should adorn a Muslim youth is that he be a good example for the people of the homeland, no matter what their religious affiliation, cooperating with them in every legitimate action for independence, for developing science, virtue, force, and resources on the basis of Islamic law, of preferring the closest relations in rights and duties. In his service of his homeland and his people, he must not, however, neglect Islam, which has honored him and raised him up by making a brother to hundreds of millions of Muslims in the world. He is a member of a body greater than his people, and his personal homeland is a part of the homeland of his religious community. He must be intent on making the progress of the part a means for the progress of the whole." So basically what he's saying is the idea that one's allegiance to their nation did not necessarily come at the expense of their allegiance to the greater Muslim community. And this was not a new concept, but in fact has roots in classical Islamic thought. The difference here, of course, is that the nation at this point was taking on a very new sense. First, as territorially bound within a state structure, and second, becoming increasingly defined at the popular level or organized alongside elite politics rather than established political authority. So shades of Rida's sentiments can be seen in the mission of Hassan al-Banna, the founder, of course, of the Muslim Brotherhood. But before we even delve into his actions, the very establishment of an organization such as the Society of the Muslim Brothers signaled a recognition that the imagining, or perhaps reimagining, of Muslim identity was now taking place at the level of society beyond the increasingly contentious domain of political elites or the increasingly limited domain of religious officials.
So the society was founded in 1928, just 4 years removed from the deepest crisis to afflict the Ummah perhaps in its history, the collapse of the caliphate that had stood for 13 centuries. This, of course, had two immediate effects. First, removing the common frame of reference that bound the global community of Muslims and leaving them essentially open to being recategorized completely along different lines, i.e., nation states. And second, it paved the way for a bottom-up process of political contestation by lay actors. In this case, a school teacher in Ismailiyah with no formal religious training launched a movement to preserve Egyptian society's Islamic character and to instill Islamic values into the state's emerging institutions. So back to this original question, was it nationalism to which the first organized popular expression of political Islam was objecting? It wouldn't appear so. While Benna was explicitly critical of colonial attempts to redraw the boundaries of the Arab territories across the former Ottoman Empire, he agreed that Muslims should, to borrow a contemporary slogan, think globally but act locally. He was critical of the partisanship of the liberal parliamentary experiment and critical of the corruption of the monarchy, but he stopped short of questioning the entire legitimacy of the Egyptian state and was content operating within the bounds of that state. In fact, he stood for parliamentary elections on more than one occasion and wrote public letters to the king imploring him to implement Islamic reforms within the Egyptian state and to lead the Muslim Ummah by example. As the movement expanded beyond Egypt, it developed local branches that were determined purely along national lines. A Sudanese Ikhwan, a Syrian Ikhwan, a Jordanian Ikhwan, and so forth. As the only one without a state to which it could be confined, the Palestinian Ikhwan, of course, was subsumed beneath its neighbors, which is actually the exception that tends to prove the rule. In effect, what the Muslim Brotherhood was resisting was not so much nationalism as its secular variation that had come to dominate the state-building process. The leading intellectuals who were articulating this vision for the Egyptian state were not only the leaders of the Weft Party, but even figures like Ali Abdul-Razzaq, who argued, of course, that the Ummah was never intended to be united politically, and Taha Hussein, who believed that Egypt's future lay in adopting a completely Western European model for social and political organization. From that moment on, the battle lines were drawn, and those advocating for an Islamic character to the modern nation state would find themselves marginalized on the outside looking in. The state would continue to privilege a narrow reading of nationalism that limited the place of Islamic values in its institutions. I hesitate to call this a secular approach to the state, considering that the state nevertheless moved to exercise control over religious institutions, such as the move, of course, to nationalize Al-Azhar, one of the oldest independent institutions of Islamic learning. So had the emerging post-colonial states truly adopted a liberal system, perhaps the future course of Islamist advocacy would have been different. Islamist parties would have more passionately embraced their role as Muslim Democrats in the same way that Christian Democrats were emerging in Europe after World War II. But that's not what happened. Instead, the 1950s and 60s saw the replacement of these liberal elites with the radical nationalism of military governments and mass political parties like the Ba'ath. And of course, the subsequent repression of all political trends within society. Which brings us to Sayyid Qutb. Don't worry, I'm not going to argue that Sayyid Qutb was secretly a nationalist. Of course, among other things, he writes that Islam then is the only divine way of life which brings out the noblest human characteristics, developing and using them for the construction of human society. Those who deviate from the system and want some other system, whether it's based on nationalism, color and race, class struggle, or similar corrupt theories, are truly the enemies of mankind. So there's no doubt that by the 1960s, the Islamist political trend has skewed away from its tacit acceptance of nationalism as the basis for contemporary political organization. But what I would add is that in our reading of the evolution of Islamic political thought, we must take the context into account. And so I don't mean to challenge Nazih Ayyubi's thesis in overstating the Arab state, but I think it's important to note that his is a political economy analysis. If we're going by a different metric, namely the state's determination to impose a particular definition of the nation, then it's hard to overstate the extent to which these radical nationalist regimes worked to force a singular vision of the state and its national character onto their societies, a project that faced vehement rejection from large segments of their societies, of course most prominently among them the Islamists. So in other words, what I'm saying is that as long as Gamal Abdel Nasser or Hafiz al-Assad or Saddam Hussein would dictate what it meant to be Egyptian or Syrian or Iraqi, these groups wanted nothing to do with those national identities. In fact, Abdel Nasser not only wanted to define what it meant to be Egyptian, he wanted to define Arab identity more broadly, which meant that Islamists at this particular juncture were not only critical of their respective national projects, but openly rejected Arab nationalism as a project, something that we don't really actually see much to that extent, at least in previous eras. The 1967 defeat served as a critical breaking point, an event that proved to Islamists that Arab nationalism was an insufficient basis upon which to rally the Ummah. And so from here, one could follow two distinct threads on the question of Islamism and nationalism. On the one hand, there are those who internalized the Qutbist critique in the post-1967 Islamist literature with its condemnation of nationalism as typified in these specific authoritarian regimes, viewing them as irredeemable and therefore to be opposed purely through the lens of the Ummah. Groups like Al-Jama'ah al-Islamiyya and Takfir wal-Hijra engaged in armed conflict with the state. That Hijra, or immigration, which involved a total boycott of the state and the retreat of its followers to the caves of Upper Egypt, became viewed as the only viable option, is indicative of the deep-seated but perhaps unsustainable rejection of one's nation. Another form of immigration that we see, which proved to be more durable, was the engagement in a kind of pan-Islamist resistance as the one seen, of course, in the Afghan Jihad of the 1980s, and the subsequent formation of Al-Qaeda as an extraterritorial expression of anti-nationalism. But on the other hand, the bulk of the Islamist movement would continue to seek opportunities to insert itself within the national context. One of the unintended consequences, perhaps, of the attempts by these dictatorships to impose a powerful state onto their societies is that it established a fixation among Islamists with state power in an unprecedented way. The Muslim Brotherhood, of course, benefited from the liberalization policies of the Sadat regime to expand their presence in the social service sector, gain control of student unions, professional syndicates, and eventually pursue representation in the parliament during the early Mubarak years. So if attempted participation within the bounds of nation states becomes the key feature of Islamist movements by the late 80s, it was really quite jarring for those of us who are familiar with this history to hear the conversations that were being had in the wake of the Arab Spring. Would Islamist parties play by the rules? Would they affirm their commitment to the state, to democracy and equal citizenship, to the international system and their treaty obligations? It's surprising that in all of these discussions, and even those, by the way, that were being had internally within Islamist parties, that as they're sort of thinking about the assumption of power in the wake of the 2011 uprisings, there were no real attempts to apply any kind of knowledge of prior experiences. But I do want to mention two cases that should have been informative for Islamists in the sort of 2011 to 2013 period, if they could only have sort of looked beyond their immediate situations. And the first of these is Algeria. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but Algeria in the 1990s, following a sort of brief political opening, had an election in 1990. The Islamic Salvation Front contested local, provincial, and national legislative elections and was poised to win a majority in the parliament. Then the military intervenes, canceling the elections, banning the feasts, and arresting its leadership. A civil war ensues with atrocities committed on all sides. The feast itself gave way, was marginalized, and gave way to the armed Islamic group, a militant movement that sought to overthrow the government entirely. Over the next 6 years, 150,000 Algerians were killed in fighting as the military sought to restore order by clamping down on all opposition and ending any possibility for any future inclusive political system in Algeria. The second case I want to mention is Sudan. Since he emerged onto the scene in the 1960s, Hassan al-Turabi developed an experimental model of Islamist activism that tried its hand as a movement. At one point or another, it was a movement of elitist intellectuals. At another point, it was trying to develop a mass party. And at other points, it was also, of course, a partner to military regimes. The National Islamic Front, which was the name of the party that Turabi founded, asserted its Sudanese nationalist character even as it worked to implement the Sharia reforms that were part of the Numeri regime's Islamization policies in the early 80s. But following the failure of that experiment, the NIF yet again backed another military leader, this time quietly sponsoring the coup that brought Omar al-Bashir to power in 1989, making Hassan al-Turabi the most successful Islamist to ever achieve political power in the Sunni world. But in 1992, Turabi delivered a speech to the Royal Society of Arts in London in which he declared, quote, the failure of the nation-state model. And here I'm quoting quickly from Willow Berridge's new book on Hassan al-Turabi, that he argued that it had done little to benefit Muslim society and that even after the establishment of the modern nation-state, the bulk of Muslims had remained largely extraterritorial in their associational sympathies. He acknowledged that the nation-state of the 20th century had not replaced a pristine and homogeneous Islamic ummah. This is really quite remarkable. Turabi is saying this not from prison or from exile, but in 1992, 3 years after winning the most powerful position one could possibly achieve, becoming the kind of ideological head of state. I think this is really significant that having come face to face with political power, he comes to this startling realization that it's not quite what it was cracked up to be, that perhaps there was a bit of disillusionment there that I think should have served as a lesson perhaps to those who came later. And so what I think that these experiences tell us in a lot of ways is that the question here is not necessarily whether Islamism has been able to adapt nationalism as part of its mission, but rather whether nations or the certain particular version of the nation state that we see emerging in the Arab Middle East during this period was able to adapt or include Islamism as part of its own mission. And I think we see this echoes of this, of course, with the Brotherhood's experience in Egypt over the last few years. In many ways, the Morsi presidency, I think, is very much akin to a kind of organ transplant in which the host body basically rejects the organ. It simply was not going to be allowed to, fit within the kind of dynamic that we see within the state. And so as we look ahead, just very quickly as I wrap up, Islamist movements, I think, face one of two choices: either the complete wholehearted embrace of the nationalized model of Islamism that has culminated in what we see with the Ennahda experiment, or that of the Justice and Development Party in Morocco. Again, depending on who you ask, these are seen as either complete total success stories or perhaps total capitulations to the pressures of the modern nation state. Or they can completely reject this model and propose the establishment of something entirely new. The counterpoint, of course, to Ennahda and PJD that we see is probably the Islamic State that has emerged out of the ashes of Iraqi and Syrian national projects and has found sympathy from the wounded, although not totally collapsed, national projects across the region, and indeed, perhaps one could say, the world. But maybe this is just the historian in me, but I'm not quite ready to declare the end of the nation state just yet. I know for the past few days we've been hearing that the Ummah is dead. We've heard the nation state is dead. It seems everything is dead. I don't know what's still left for us to talk about. But I don't quite see that the nation state has disappeared just yet. I think it's still very much a reality and one that we should continue to take seriously. And that it's faced far more formidable threats than the one that the Islamic project has posed to it thus far. And it has managed to weather those storms. And certainly it seems to be managing the storm of the threat of the Islamist project. But I just want to conclude on one quick note, which is that last week the Pew Research Center released a study of official state religions. And so they basically went around the world and they said, how many countries have official religions? Only 20% of countries in the world have official state religions. But of those 20%, more than half of them, 27 countries out of 43, are Muslim countries that have Islam as their declared state religion. And of course, as we survey the kind of rogues gallery of military dictatorships and autocratic monarchies, one would be, that Nader just told us about, one would be hard-pressed to find in anything, any of these declarations, more than just simply a cynical ploy to maintain legitimacy over a pliant population. But the fact that Islam figures into the nationalist project of these states that would otherwise be happy to rid themselves of it as a force of social cohesion and national identity, I think speaks to its capacity to endure all attempts to constrain, exploit, or otherwise displace it. And so the voices of opposition persisting in their struggle for empowerment within their respective national context, I think, would do well to remember that. Thank you.
I'm not Abdullah Madi, I'm Amr Darrag. I got an invitation from Professor Sami Al-Arian to replace Dr. Madi presenting this paper or talking about this topic about 3 days ago. And it didn't take me much time to accept for several reasons. One of them is that I cannot say no to Professor Sami. The other thing is that this is an opportunity for me to squeeze myself in within a distinguished panel of speakers like Professor Esposito or Professor Tariq Ramadan or Professor Ahmed Shaheen and the others. And the third reason is because the topic is one of the major issues and topics that we are handling in our organization, the Egyptian Institute for Political and Strategic Studies, due its obvious importance. And I have one little, or not very little, challenge here, which is distinguishing in my talk between the academic nature of this conference and the political background that I belong to. Being an ex-minister in a cabinet of Dr. Morsi, of course it's very difficult for me to separate myself from this, but I'll try my best. And since I'm now back to the academic life, so I'll manage, inshallah. I'm not going to waste too much time talking about how in modern democracies the relationship between the authority that is based on the will of the people and the institutions of the state that should be independent, and how this has created a balance between the civil and the military establishments in stable democracies. I'm not going to waste time. I'm sure that probably all of you are very familiar with that. But what I'm going to talk about is, in our area, how we moved from this ideal situation, or may not be that much ideal actually in modern democracies, but close, but to the miserable situation we are in right now. Of course, we have been through the last maybe 70 or 75 years. We've been going through a lot of military coups and transfer of power in different forms from civilians into the military. And the military since then have been manipulating and monopolizing power all over the place. And they have been pretty much supported by the superpower of the world today, by the US, because this helped the US a lot achieve a lot of its objectives, whether in fighting communism in Latin America, for example, or in fighting so-called terrorism in our area now, or what is termed as the political Islam. So this suits them fine, but we need to go back and try to see how this miserable situation emerged. There are actually two groups of factors. One of them is related to the mere establishment of the nation state in our area, and the other group of reasons is related to the practice of the regimes. When it comes to the establishment of the nation state in the Arabic world particularly, we can definitely acknowledge an emergence of some sort of a distorted version of the state without any clear political faith or reference that is compatible with the mainstream of the nation. So that was something that was almost imposed on the nations, the people. The other thing is that although the nation states, when they were established in our area, were calling for democracy and the state of the law and institutions, so on and so forth, but reality is actually something which is completely different to the benefit of a powerful and oppressive authority for a very limited set of interests, helped and allowed for by a set of forces, either internally, domestically, or internationally. Also, maybe the third context is that the nation states presumably should emerge in order to protect and support the unity of the societies. But in our area, actually, the contrary happened. The emergence of these states led to the divisions, a lot of divisions within our Ummah, our nation, and with a lot of very nice words, but actually people are finding out more and more that that was a very big game of deception that has been practiced all over the years. So this is not an easy thing. I mean, the nature of the establishment of the nation state in our area, this of course helped a lot in the gradual intrusion of the military into controlling our faiths in our area. Of course, I cannot put the whole blame on the military establishment or the outside. Definitely the elite in our societies have been for a long time divided, weak, corrupt. You can say a lot of things, including everybody. I'm not relieving anybody from the blame. So these factors actually have helped to the establishment of different forms of the control of the military over the political life of our societies. Sometimes you find a military power emerge through fighting the occupation, like in Algeria, and then it was normal to deliver the faith of the country to the military to govern. In Egypt, there is something similar, but also was coupled by the ruling of the monarchy and corrupt group of politicians, and so on and so forth. There are different forms, but all of them have led to a state of control of the military rule over our faith and our nations. This is the first set of reasons why the military got in. But the second set is related to the practice in power itself. And I'm going to concentrate on Egypt, not just because I'm Egyptian, which is good enough, of course, but for two other reasons, actually. I believe that the Egyptian model for the control of military over the political life has reached probably the ultimate strength of how the military can control a society and can control the political life. And this is now, I believe that this is the most powerful form of controlling the political life in our modern days. So it's a classical academic kind of case study. And the second thing is that, of course, Egypt is quite important. Whether of course, affecting a lot of things that are going on in our area. We've experienced that, for example, through the liberation phase in 1950s, through the Arab Spring, the start of the Arab Spring, and also after the military coup in Egypt. So it's very important to look into this model as a very good case study. Anyway, the conditions, as I said, we're talking now about the practice. That whatever the form that the military got into the controlling seat on the political life, we have a form of a developed police state, or sometimes people use the term deep state, as it is used here extensively in Turkey, and also it has been used a lot in Egypt. That is controlling the fate of the people with extensive budget, with a great amount of independence in running its affairs and then running the affairs of the others, of everybody else. And all these conditions definitely wouldn't have led to the development of a healthy civil-military relationship or institutionalization of this kind of relationship. Also, of course, the middle income society in our societies is quite weak and for over the last decades, and did not really do its role in leading a political, an effective political role in our society, except maybe for a very limited period of time, maybe 18 days during the 2011 revolution. So, of course, also the external factor, as I referred to, the Arab-Israeli or Arab-Zionist conflict that the military, the Arab armies have utilized in order to justify their developing role in controlling everybody's fate. So, in Egypt, if we talk about Egypt, for example, we follow, since Nasser, the development from a group of people emerging from the military into ruling the country, and then turning into a one-man show, a dictator type of regime. The same happened during Sadat's time. The same happened during Mubarak's time, and of course it's happening now, right? In Sisi's time, underway and under development. We acknowledge, or we find that the dictator would get rid of everybody else who is around him. And we can, of course, get this a lot of information in history about that. Right now, for example, in our studies, we identified that Sisi got rid of 27 of the leadership of the military council. I mean, the number of people in the military council is less than that, but some people were replaced twice. So 27 people were replaced, and right now there are only 3 effective of the leadership in the military council at the time when the coup took place. One of them is the Minister of Defense. Of course, he's immune according to the Constitution. The other one is the Chief of Staff, who happened to be, his daughter and Sisi's son are married to each other, or the other way around. I'm not sure. And the third one is the leader of the Air Force, which is known, not to be that much effective in leading military coups. So everybody else who's controlling arms or weapons or is in the position to potentially lead some sort of another movement to oust or to depose Sisi, all of them have been replaced, and we are very quickly moving to a one-man show again. And the way for the dictators to be able to control the military establishment, they have got to a lot of practices. Some of them are related to, particularly during Mubarak's time and during Sisi's time, to give a lot of benefits, whether financial or political or society or to the military and to the members, whether the current members of the military or the retired ones. So, as Dr. Yazid Saigh described beautifully in his well-known study on the Republic of the Officers, Jumhuriyat al-Dhubat, the military people live through their life just looking forward to get the benefits when they are retired, to be in charge of one of the establishments, or to get a help to be a politician or a governor or whatever. So they are always in a state to looking forward to be something more when they retire, so they always keep loyal. Most of them, of course. And whoever is not, there are other ways to deal with. We can also follow, after the Camp David Accords and the military budget. Okay, the military budget was shrinking very much, from 33% of the GDP in mid-70s down to 2.2% of the GDP in 2010. And for the establishment to accept this shrinkage, of course, you need to give something else, which is practically the economy of the military, which is quite independent and providing a lot of self-financing that is needed to initially to get their things done, and also for them to get extra benefits. Also, of course, the military aid that is provided by the United States, $1.3 billion every year, which is the second largest amount of money given to a military to a country anywhere in the world after Israel. Also, this kind of aid is connected with the so-called war on terrorism that is justifying, for a lot of reasons, for the military to keep on controlling the political life of our countries and get continuous support from abroad. So this way, you cannot really look very much to an external support to any kind of institutionalization of the civil-military relationship in a country like Egypt in the foreseen future. Now the situation in Egypt, we are moving actually to an unprecedented situation, and I've heard this myself from some of the leaders of the military council, that why are you saying that there was a coup against Dr. Morsi? Actually, Dr. Morsi is the one who made a coup against the way this country is being run. The modern Egypt has always been, actually has developed as a military, and around that there is a state. So Egypt is a military with a state. It's not a state with a military. And this is like an ideology for them. It's becoming an ideology. They really believe that. Like we believe in Islam, they believe on the superiority of the military in Egypt. So this is something beyond benefits. It is intrinsic. It's inherent. It is very difficult. Now people, argue about whether the military control 20% or 40% or 60% of the economy. I myself claim that they now control 100% of the economy. You cannot do any kind of economic activity now in Egypt without passing through the military. So in order to get out of this, I don't think we can keep on thinking of the traditional ways that you find in textbooks about dealing with how you get the military out of the political life. I don't find any alternative than going back to the path that we started back in 2011. The revolutionary path that was aiming at changing everything. Actually, in the way a lot of things have been going on. One of the major things is this, what we're talking about today. In order for us, and this is the last topic I'm going to cover, we have to distinguish between two basic phases in order to talk about getting the military out of the political life. One of them is what is termed the democratic transition, and the other one is the democratic transformation. We have to distinguish between the two. The democratic transition, we just need to get the power to get out of the hands of the military and give it to the civilians. Okay, God only knows how, but this is the transition, the transitional period, and then we can start thinking about the transformation, the democratic transformation period, where we establish a true and healthy relationship between the military and the civilian. And there is a lot of mix-up. That's a lot of people, when they talk about this, they believe that they can impose issues related to the democratic transformation, while we haven't even achieved anything in the democratic transition so far. So it's very important to distinguish between the two. In many of the cases, yes. I have the disadvantage of being the last one, so I bear the extra time from the other colleagues. But anyway, I'll end up now in 2 minutes, inshallah. We have to understand that, maybe I don't have time to go through how, and although this is an important part, how we can do this, but we have to acknowledge that if we talk about Egypt, the factors that are needed to achieve a democratic transition now, they are all not present, whether intentionally or if we talk about, for example, an inclusive social and economic and political opposition that can gather in order to get out of this, we don't find that. We do not find an understanding of the military that their persistence to be in power actually reduces the capacity of the military establishment itself in doing the role that that is supposed to be doing. So it's very difficult, or also the emergence of a large and wide civil society movement that is really pushing for this transition to take place. All this is very far, and we have to acknowledge that. And about the future objective of the transformation, of course, this is very well documented in textbooks. I'm not going to talk about that. I have a lot to say about it, but I'm not, due to time limitations. But again, if you apply the same methodology, you find out that we are still even much further away from achieving a healthy democratic transformation for the military to give up their power. In the case of Egypt, of course, as the most difficult case. And I'm concentrating on Egypt because if we manage to have this happening in Egypt, I believe this would be the key of a lot of improvements and developments all through our area. One of the final points that I want to stress is that when we put the blame, again, as I said before, we cannot just put the blame on the military. There is an area, there is a playground that is open for them, and they just play their game, and they are managing. But if we look back to our experience after 2011 revolution, we found that all of us, all of the people who were supposedly or should have supposedly taken charge after the revolution, they very simply handed over the power and the responsibility of the transitional period to the military. So we have nobody other than ourselves to blame in this. And I'm not relieving, of course, the Brotherhood as the largest political and social movement in Egypt of the responsibility for accepting this or allowing this to happen. I'm also not, of course, relieving the others from the blame, but and the other thing is that during the time where the Brotherhood also was supposedly in power, which was not the case, as most of you know, but at least they were relatively empowered. They didn't really do that much effort, or tried, but they did not succeed, to say the least, to pave the way for a proper transition in order to get rid of the role of the military from the political life. And finally, the others, other than the Islamists, they allowed the military to undertake a military coup in order for themselves to have their place. Of course, that was a big fake as well. So all of us are responsible. Now, I believe that the society has lost confidence in most of the political powers, and they are looking for new elite, new ideas, new set of people to administer the change that will definitely happen, but this will be an extension of the revolution of 2011 and not anything else. Thank you very much.
I thank all of our speakers. They all made important analysis about these different challenges, fault lines, and they invite us to a good reflection. I also want to offer my comments on each of the presentation. First, beginning with Professor Ezzat's talk. You pointed out to the daily manifestations of the secularism and how it makes the debate about secularism more complicated than we used to think. And coming from a Turkish background, we know that in Turkey also the whole debates about architecture, city-urban planning, and these are very important. Also the different views about the manners, daily life. So in a sense, that complicates the narrative about secularism, but at the same time it shows that the cleavages are deeper than that, like the more entrenched and more difficult to resolve. And in one section in your presentation, you talk about the concept, virtues, Islamic public good. So I would like you to relate how how do you think this concept of Islamic public good, and what do you mean by that, and could you elaborate more on that, and how do you think that can answer to this cleavage between religion and secularism in Muslim societies? With respect to Professor Hashemi's paper, you are rejecting primordialism and espousing constructivism in relation to analyzing sectarianism. And this is also a common framework used in the nationalism studies. Right. Yeah, so I kind of see the parallel between them. That said, I am not sure whether the constructivist approach responds to the issue of the divisions between Sunnis and the Shias or different sectarian sects. At the end of the day, even if we agree that primordialism doesn't explain the variation in the intensity of the violence and the geographical variation, still, I'm guessing you are not going to reject the whole, that people have different identities. And even if we remove the authoritarian regimes, yet you think responsible for the sectarianism, and which I agree. But even in a democratic regime, there would be still an issue of how Sunnis and the Shias would live together. And I would like you to offer your ideas about those issues. For Professor Arian, for your paper, you referred to one sentence used in the globalization studies, which is think globally and act locally. And I wonder, and at the end of your paper, you said there are either two options for Muslims, either a nationalist Islamic movements or pursuing like Ummah, ideal of the Ummah. But I wonder whether these are the only two options, because I am less inclined to underestimate that idea of think globally and act locally, and I think it may be one way of interpreting how Muslims living under different nation states still act locally, but still motivated with the vision of the Ummah, how they can help Ummah. So since, as you said, nation state is not that, it's not going to disappear soon, but why we are dismissing that option why don't we see that option as a legitimate expression of being affiliated with the Ummah while acting locally? That's my question. And finally, for Dr. Darrag's paper, you obviously point out that there should be a basic consensus about values, principles in a democratic society. But this did not work one time in Egypt. So how is it going to work in the second time? And unless people agree on a certain the Rawlsian term overlapping consensus of what does it mean in a Muslim country, then how we can have how this democratic movement should succeed for the second time if it failed for the first time. These are my questions, and you can answer now or we can take questions. It's up to you. Please, yeah, okay, then let's answer the question, please.
Okay, so the shift that happened actually is the talk from the public good, that people think in a collective manner, that when I'm considering my own good, I have to balance the good of the others. Notions of sacrifice, notions of compassion, notions of birr, all these Quranic notions upon which the notion or the paradigm of civility of Islam is based have been changing not in terms of a counter-faith discourse, changing by enforcing the model of modernity through the time of colonialization, and afterwards with the rise of the nation state, and taking all the procedures that would modernize society without the dimension of freedom or democracy, etc. And the shift that happened was from public good, the notion of the public good, al-khayr al-aam, to public goods. That we are thinking about education, how much I can get, subsidies, it's like I'm thinking in terms of that mentality of the modern citizen. I have entitlements, I have rights, I'm paying taxes. So I'm thinking of citizenship not as a sense of belonging to a community, so citizenship related to civility, but it's related to the state. And there is a big difference between this and that. And of course, the machine of the urbanization, modernization, secularization, industrialization, and then post-industrial age have been working working to sort of fragment society. So the individual today, all he's thinking about how to work hard in order to buy a flat, how to think hard in order to get a flat in a gated community so that I can secure my family because the community is gated and they have security at the door. To think about having a better car, thinking about sending the children to study abroad, you know, you're not thinking about the common good anymore. And it is also related to the economy of time. It's very philosophical. It's not only sociological and anthropological. How much time do you have to invest in the public sphere and invest in public common good? It needs investment. It's exactly like investing in love relations, you know. It just doesn't happen because there is a Cupid, you know, feeling, you know, you love someone. If you don't invest in that relation, you end up, it ends up in pieces, you know. So people do not invest in the community, do not give time, and time is limited because they are in the machine of working from 9 to 5. And when you do an interview, they tell you, are you willing to work beyond working hours? Are you willing to travel instantly if you are assigned? Are you willing to work under stress? It means, are you willing to be unhuman? And you say, yes, with the bigs, I'm ready to go anywhere. I'm ready to travel. If I'm assigned to live in Singapore for 2 years, I will just take the kids with me. And there are sociological studies about that, how this corrodes the sense of community. There is a very nice book by Richard Sennett talking about corrosion of character, how this mobility actually corrodes the sense of commitment, because you don't have lifelong friends, you don't have lifelong space, you don't have lifelong house, you don't have lifelong anything. And then you expect, of course, in the book of Zygmunt Bauman, Liquid Love, what do you expect people to live with each other for 50 years? They were not brought up to live with other for more than 10 seconds, you know. And then if someone disagrees with you, you log off or you block them. There is no sense of negotiation, the use of language, patience, silence because you're out of respect, everything. So the public good transformed into public goods. That how much can I get, how much can I benefit? And this is a problem that actually it strikes the very notion of citizenship and civility as we can understand it from an Islamic civilizational perspective.
Okay, thank you.
I want to hear what the audience has to say. So very quickly to your question, I wasn't suggesting that conflict between different groups would go away. There is always different groups in society and there's always tension between them. But the good thing about democracy is that there are nonviolent ways of addressing those conflicts and peaceful options. There's also, at least ideally, accountability, representation, ways of negotiating conflict and preventing leaders from manipulating a political system to perpetuate their power, to mobilize identities, which is exactly what happens in the context of authoritarian regimes. So the difference is that it's in democratic states, there's conflict, but you can negotiate those conflicts in ways that don't lethalize them or turn into political violence. I mean, it still happens. I mean, in the United States today, we have a democracy that's quickly diminishing and withering away, and you're seeing precisely Donald Trump doing what other authoritarian regimes and leaders in other countries are doing. Right now, there's considerable amount of tension between not sectarian groups, but at least communal groups, white Americans and African Americans. And the reason why the level of tension has risen is because Donald Trump is deliberately, catering to and politicizing and mobilizing his white populist nationalist base, and thus leading to conflict. So even in democratic societies,
so there's a temptation in the democratic system to
do that, yeah. But I think it's not a coincidence that it's precisely at the moment when democracy is decaying in the United States that you are seeing an upsurge in these types of communal conflicts. It's not sectarian conflict, but it's still communal conflicts, but the dynamics are exactly the same.
Okay, thank you.
Just quickly, I think it would be ideal to try to find a medium between the two options as far as how to, pursue Islamic activism in a way that is, politically oriented within a nation-state context and also has some sort of international or pan-Islamic dimension. But I think the practicalities of that have proven that it's really has not been possible so far, and I haven't seen a model that's been successful. I mean, first you're talking about overcoming the structural limitations and barriers to entry for Islamist actors across every context, right? And I think in many ways Turkey is one of the very rare success cases where they've managed over tremendous odds to actually come to a place where they can be a prominent political actor. And then once you achieve that kind of position, then your responsibilities primarily are to your nation, are to your country, are to your system, and to your state. To the extent that you can act on behalf of causes and issues that are of concern to the wider Muslim community, we've seen it happen on many occasions, and we can think of many examples, but I think that, when you look at both Turkey, Morocco, Tunisia, places where Islamists have had kind of a prominence, or Sudan, for instance, in the past, that there's still a kind of a hierarchy of action that privileges the local and the national at the expense, sometimes perhaps, of the transnational. I think if we abandon the political dimensions of these movements, you can have charitable networks that are international. You can have ones, as long as they don't have any pretensions to political power, they can certainly live. They can still think globally and act locally. But I don't see that, at least as long as politics is as narrowly defined as it is right now. Okay. Thank you.
The question you asked about consensus is really very important, and the reason I believe we have failed in achieving this is that we have been looking to the issue from a very wrong angle. We have been talking about consensus as if Islamists have to be more liberal and leftists have all of a sudden to go to the right hand and vice versa. But this is not reality. And if we look everywhere in the world, you find divisions, you find a great deal of actually even polarization in the United States, in Europe, everywhere. So if we try to spend our efforts for people to change their nature, the way they basically think, this is bound to fail. But we have to redefine consensus in a different way. What do we really need to achieve through this consensus? We are, 2011, we agreed that we want to achieve a great deal of change in everything related to the way our societies are being governed, the kind of hegemony that has been practiced on our nations by the outside world. We have to agree on a set of objectives that everybody agrees on, and then we have to agree on how to come out of this miserable situation. We have to get rid of the military rule. We have to do this and that, regardless of our ideologies, because you can never achieve consensus based on any concessions in your ideology. Then afterwards, we need to find out ways that, provided that if we can succeed in the democratic transition, then we study how we perform the democratic transformation, how we define the civil-military relationship, how we talk about transitional justice, how we get the economy out of its miserable situation, and so on and so forth, how we solve the social problems, how we regain our basic values. All this is this is a very big agenda that we can work on and achieve consensus, rather than trying to do that based on ideology, which is bound to fail.
Thank you. So we can take questions from the audience. Professor Imad Shahin. How many minutes?
I would like to make one minor point and ask one question. But first, I would like, of course, to thank the panelists for very rich and insightful presentations. My point is Dr. Abdullah, because really he helped me bridge this gap or dichotomy between nationalists and Islamists, really in a very nice way. However, I think we also should make a distinction between the attempts or the successive attempts of Islamists since the beginning of the 20th century to synthesize or to strike a synthesis between Islam and any kind of an incoming or encroaching ideology. They have been in this dilemma for actually a century or more. Like, for example, trying to prove that Islam and nationalism, or Islam can assimilate nationalism and they are reconcilable, or Islam and socialism. And then now Islam and democracy, or we come up with the idea of the Islamic civil state or civic state that is Islamic and so on. So I think this distinction. However, the paradox or the provocative idea I would like to make is that in the final analysis, I might be wrong, but if you look at those who really succeeded in establishing an Islamic state are the unilingual and the unicultural, the Wahhabis and the Khomeini, who didn't care anything about the synthesis. They couldn't even speak another language. Islam is self-contained for them, and there's something to think about. There's something to think. Yes, exactly. Just exactly this is the response I want from you. The question is to Dr. Heba. Now, it seems to me that in addition to the impossible state, now we're having the impossible city. So where do Muslims go? If Jacques, where is Jacques? If Jacques were here, he would tell us to heaven immediately, right? So, but he's not here. So where do Muslims go? Do we build Islamic cities? Also gated. The same thing, for example, we built in Egypt or everywhere. Islamic schools, Islamic buses, Islamic companies, Islamic masrafiyat, Islamic banking, Islamic finances. So where do we go? Thank you.
We can take that question. Yes.
Assalamu alaikum. Can you hear? Okay. My question's for Dr. Heba Raouf. Given your work on urban spaces and your comments on capitalism's influence on Muslims and your remark just now from the movement from public good to public goods, I wanted to ask if you could possibly comment on the very present dominant mall culture in the GCC countries like Bahrain, where I currently live in Saudi Arabia, and how they've become increasingly urbanized and developed. And as they become urbanized and developed, you see more malls being built. And I ask because there's this specific idea that Michel Foucault in Discipline and Punish, he devotes a chapter on Bentham's panopticon structure, which is used in like penitentiaries and prisons. And basically what this is that it's the structure that's characterized by cells along a periphery with sort of a vacant center, which the only thing there is kind of that surveillance control center, allowing for the full visibility of these cells. And so it's the segmented and spatially partitioned space, and I have heard this being compared to the modern mall structure. And you see this, I mean, not exactly, it's not an exact blueprint, but it does control the movement of peoples, allows for full visibility and sort of enclosed dungeon-like structure. So, and I wanted to ask, and then malls also kill time too. So kind of have those very common characteristics. So I wanted to ask about what your thoughts would be on sort of the implications on religiosity, sociological implications. I'm going to kind of stay away from the political ones for now, but so.
We will take two more questions. Ömer, Professor Anju.
Okay, Bismillah. Thank you very much for excellent presentations. I see that they saved best for last. Question for Abdullah. I heard you say that the state had been liberal, or the state wasn't so secular, right? It perhaps the Society of Muslim Brothers would have perhaps moved in a different direction. And what the assumption that I'm hearing is, and I'm going to push against it a little bit, which is that it was neither liberal nor secular, as if liberal and secular states in fact do allow all kinds of freedom and flexibility to religions. In reality, people who study very advanced liberal and secular states find that in fact that's never the case. So perhaps it was both liberal and secular, perhaps it didn't. So secularism nearly always uses religion everywhere, from France to the United States. and it responds to the state elite, respond to the problem of control and other goals that they have by adjusting their responses to how much secularism they're going to allow. And if religion will come to in their favor and help them build a consensus around national goals, they would use religion, right? So my problem, what I'm trying to say is that perhaps that was not the problem. Perhaps we're seeing state liberalism and secularism as boxes that come in a certain shape, and maybe they don't. In fact, they are negotiated. And the same, I would say, is true of religious actors, or the Islamists, as you're calling them. They perhaps also define themselves in response to the state. And I'm talking about modern religious actors, that is, the masses as opposed to institutions or the ulama or somebody else. These are much more fluid and numerous religious actors, and they also respond to the states in which they live, so including how and whether they use national rhetoric. So the question is, what survives as an agent if all of these actors that we're talking about are fluid and responding to each other? And there I think that perhaps it's the practices or repertoire of practices and discursive traditions that, even though they transform over time, but they also aim to identify what is it that they're going to keep constant. And Dr. Heba talked about these practices of building and dwelling, and I think that there is this point that you perhaps need to have conversation with lived practices as well as intellectual practices in traditions, and that's another way to look at what survives this very fluid universe. The other question for the last speaker, I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name, this idea that Egypt is a military with a country on the side, as opposed to a country with military, this actually is a very common way to describe most developing nations. So it's not a new problem. And I was in 2011 in Egypt talking to people. This was the golden era where everybody was talking openly in Egypt. First time I'd seen that. One thing that I found amazing was that everybody was blaming Egyptian system and Hosni Mubarak as if this is the first time in human history that crony capitalism and dictatorship had come together to create this kind of situation, as if Egyptians didn't know anyone else this was happening. And I was like, well, this happens all the time. So why are you saying it was just Hosni Mubarak and his people? And I would say the same to you. People say this about small countries all the time. The military is the only institution with a lot of money and weapons and a clear goal, whereas every other institution is breaking down, and that's the institution that therefore enriches itself and moves on, and it is able to develop an economy. So in other words, your problem is very sort of common, and therefore I would say to think about it differently. And perhaps another comment I would make is, let's not talk about failures. Like, stop talking about we all failed, but rather, because it may be that you didn't fail, you were just fine, but that perhaps think about taking responsibility in a different way. And my time is up, but I can talk to you personally.
Okay. One more question from here.
Assalamu alaikum. I thank the panel very much for the information given, and I would like to address Dr. Heba. Actually, I completely agree with you about the dualism that we live as Muslims. Actually, we are Muslims who are associated in a secular life, a secular way of life. That's completely correct. But I would remark about this connection between as of being Muslims and designing cities, something like this. I would say we are actually dealing with consciousness, because if we looked back at time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, I think they had the same problems too. And they think at baths and the way they deal when they want to make اغتسال or to go to baths, hammam. The city of Rasulullah was not designed for Muslims. It was not so very human to at that time. Despite all of that, it was a completely Islamic city, the best Islamic city ever. So it is a consciousness of Muslims, of being Muslims, and that's why upon this Islamic ideas, Islamic identity, they built and they designed their own cities and their own dwelling places. I think it's more related to consciousness, to be conscious that we are Muslims, and that means we have special needs. We need a special kind of living, and that upon this we built our own cities and our own houses. And I want to address and talk to Dr. Darrag too. Actually, I see the problem that maybe you didn't say and you wouldn't say ever. That the problem of Brotherhood at the time they took power, they didn't realize actually that they took power. It's not our problem. It's not my problem. It's not the problem of all Egyptians who went to polls and voted Mohammed Morsi and the Muslim Brothers to be the ruler of Egypt. It's not our problem that you didn't realize that in those people where your power, the power of Egypt at the time was those people who went to vote for you and to elect you. Not in the deep state or in the military. Actually, the military wouldn't give up power. Otherwise, he understands he cannot stand the power of the people at the time. So you didn't make use of this power, and that's why actually you lost the power. Brothers, and that's actually what I see in Egypt, because it seems that I am myself Egyptian. And that was at the time too, at the revolution, in the middle of the revolution. I see the problem is that we don't have politicians. And the politicians, brothers, I would say, are like football players. It doesn't mean that any one of us, he understands football very well, and they have the history of football in his mind. So I can say somebody did a goal like this in 1967, and it was in Italia, and it was like this. It doesn't mean that you understand very good in handball.
If you can wrap up the question.
Sorry,
please.
I will conclude that. It doesn't mean that you are that you understand very good in football, that you can play if you want to the ground, and you will be that. Even that you understand in politics and you are political scientist, it doesn't mean that even like the trainer of the team, it doesn't mean he will take out a player and put another player. It doesn't mean that if he went on the ground, he will play better. A politician is actually a kind of talent, and the amateurs actually doesn't have so much to do in this ground. Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, your answers to the questions.
Bismillah. Okay. Impossible state, from the impossible state to the impossible city. I think the first step would be actually the awareness and developing survival strategies, Islamic survival strategies. You cannot change now the way of life of people, and not in the lifespan of the generation can we actually reshape the cities in a way. But unless people understand it, I wish they would have understood it in Istanbul 20 years ago. You wouldn't have had this sort of distortion of the architecture of Istanbul. It would have expanded with interest in investment, but it would have had a rationale of how to expand the city. So at least people should know what the problem is, and then how to deal with it on the individual level and develop strategies of survival. What do we want to survive? It's the fitra. because it's going against your own fitra. It's trying to make you focus on your own very self and on your own very time. So eternity is not there, and goodness is not there, and it's just spreading this trivial evil, you know, that you just normalize with it. So I think that the beginning would be that. But the problem also is that we are in the middle of a transformation and we can't really see well what's going on. We are in the box. And thinking out of the box needs a bit of imagination and needs a bit of detachment. That's why I have been detaching myself for some time from a specific case or from a specific nationality. You know, it's like, because I want to see the wider scene. As Ömer said, it's sometimes not the case of Turkey, Egypt, Tunisia, Morocco. This is not, it's interesting for those who are politicians and want to work on it. As a social scientist, I'm more interested in the Sunan, in what is the age, what is the transformation that we are witnessing in our age, in this era. And I think that answering the question about the transformation of cities in the Gulf states, etc., I wouldn't call them cities. You have to be very careful with words. And the Quran reminds us all the time, don't describe something with a word, otherwise it's zur, it's shahadat zur, you know, it's not going to the court and saying something wrong. Shahadat zur is very much related to shahada. These are not states, and these are not cities. You can call them, as you mentioned, like the prison, you know, where there is a ruler and he's watching everybody, and he can actually easily, but now it's becoming a widespread trend, to take away your nationality and turn you into bidun. You know, you are talking about a market without a society. You are talking about 95% in some areas of foreigners and only 5% of original sort of inhabitants of the place. So this is not a city, full stop. Let's just find a way to describe it, invent a term, but it's a deception to call it that. The transformation that we are witnessing as well today is that not only actually in some Arab countries, but look at the transformation that started and the indicators that we started receiving since the war on Iraq. The use of black water in the commissioning of we are witnessing gradually. The structures are still there because it will take time for them to change. And at that moment, we would be in a new phase. We are in this transitional period where things look as if they are so-and-so, but they are not actually so-and-so. So in some cases, we can talk actually, and not only in third world countries, but in some countries that we consider to be like first world countries, we're talking about armies without states. We're not talking about strong armies in strong states or strong armies in failed states. We are talking about the return of the Middle Ages to mercenaries. And if an army, a regular army, is assigning mercenaries to do the dirty job, how does that actually influence the notion of army itself and the notion of sovereignty? And when mercenaries are transnational, and when we witness now a country like the Arab Emirates using mercenaries in the war in Yemen, what does that mean in terms of the rest of the Arab countries looking at that? And when there are alliances between the systems, how then do we define what's going on? We need a bit of imagination, and I claim a bit of detachment from the current, as academics, from the current affairs to see the transformation that is going on, not only in the Arab world, not only in our respective countries, but actually globally. The late capitalism is changing the core and the rationale of many institutions, while the facade is still the same. And this is the whole deception. Because at a specific moment, the facade will fall, and we will witness the ugliness when we didn't have scenarios for the future. And I think this is the challenge.
Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time, and there's some really thoughtful questions. But first, I wanted to thank my teacher and mentor, Dr. Ahmed, for his very insightful observations and comments, and I fully take those into account. I agree. I think there was definitely an attempt to reconcile Islam, as it were, with all of the different ideologies. And so singling out nationalism in this talk was kind of a bit convenient and in a way excluded some of the others. And even when I talk about Sayyid Qutb, I mean, I invoke him only as someone who is a very ardent rejection, someone who opposed nationalism. But of course, he also, at one point earlier in his career, tried to reconcile Islam with socialism, with writing social justice in Islam. So even he was engaging in this kind of conversation that you mentioned. In terms of looking at the Wahhabi or the Iranian models as being sort of monolithic and in many ways, so I think that's a fair point. The difference is, of course, is that neither of those was a kind of bottom-up movement. I mean, even if you look at the Iranian revolution beyond the actual revolution, it was still very much, the terms of the new state was dictated very much from above, in the same way the Wahhabi state was not as a result of a kind of a popular broad-based movement that Islamists elsewhere in the region are trying to pursue. And actually, even in the Iranian case, I would say that there's still an attempt to reconcile, what is this notion of an Islamic revolution in the 20th century? It's still trying to bring about a republican system, right? So it's trying to reconcile with republicanism, constitutionalism, parliamentary. I mean, it's still trying to fit this model within something that is, in some ways at least, outside of perhaps the classical tradition to a certain extent. And in terms of Ömer's comment, I mean, I'm glad you picked up on what was meant to be kind of a bit of a provocation in that statement about, what could have been, as far as if things had sort of, moved in a different direction from the so-called liberal experiment, at least in Egypt and perhaps even elsewhere. We see this in Syria, where the Brotherhood actually was elected into parliament in the 1940s and 50s. Had the situation kind of remained in that way. I mean, I agree with you. I think that there's certainly a way that we have to think about these terminologies in a way that's not fixed or static, including when we look at something like secularism as simply the absence of religion from the state or a kind of free market model. In fact, the opposite tends to be true, is what you mentioned. And I think I tried to mention this when I said, Al-Azhar, which was free and independent for its entire history, gets nationalized by none other than Gamal Abdel Nasser, who we consider to be this, staunch secularist. And in fact, the point I was making is that if you look at the suggestion I was making that could have happened in the 1950s, we see it happening 70 years later in Tunisia, when 2 years ago the Nahda had their annual conference, and they basically declared themselves to be the Muslim equivalent of the Christian Democrats of Europe. And if you listen to Ghannouchi, I mean, one of the things he did, of course, is that he said we don't need to put Sharia in the constitution. This is a Muslim country. This is already kind of a settled issue that doesn't need to be a divisive issue for our society. And the other thing that he's been saying for many years is that our role as Islamists now is not to infuse our state with religion, but rather to free Islam from the state, which I think is a very different kind of approach that in many ways I think reflects some of the points that you're making about how the fluidity of these kinds of activist missions and the response to the kinds of pressures that they find themselves under within the supposedly liberal or even secular kind of order.
Thank you very much for your questions, and I start with my colleague who referred to the 2011 events and talking to people, and he found out that as if they didn't know anybody else other than Hosni Mubarak. But the truth is that they did not really know anybody else other than Hosni Mubarak. Hosni Mubarak had been in power for more than 30 years. Anybody who is 40 years or younger, and if you made a survey in Tahrir Square at that time, probably they wouldn't tell you that nobody else ruled Egypt other than Hosni Mubarak. So like all the problems of Hosni Mubarak's era and the previous eras were magnified in the context of Hosni Mubarak's time. And of course, I would like to be as positive as you were by not referring to the word failed, but unfortunately we did fail. And we have to start from acknowledging that we did fail. We did fail because we could not understand the nature of the phase that we were going through. Mm-hmm. And we failed because we were not prepared to deal with phase. And it is very nice also to talk about the power of the people and the will of the people, and we have to use the power of the people. But we are putting too much on the people this way, because the people, yes, they did their part going out in 2011, but they are also helpless. I mean, they handed over the power to leaders. People want to see leaders who can lead them in order to achieve their objectives. They didn't study democratic transformation. They didn't study how transitions take place. They didn't know that. They want somebody who knows about these issues and handle them properly. So that is why actually we did not succeed in handling this. And in my opinion, probably the biggest mistake is that we handled that period as if we are in a phase of a democratic transformation rather than a transition, as I referred in my talk. We need, first of all, to really get the power out of the police state, the deep state, the military state, back to the civilian life, and then we work on the transformation. We cannot, we assume that we are trying to build a democracy while we still did not or had not achieved the right transition at that time. So unfortunately, I have to say that we failed, but this is very important to acknowledge in order to succeed in future, inshallah.
Okay, thank you very much for this great panel.
Thank you very much. This was really great panel. Thank you so much for your presentations. We have just some departing gifts from the center. We have the plates with our logo that you can keep in your offices. Dr. Nader Hashemi.
Thank you very much.
Heba. Dr. Heba Raouf.
Dr. Darrag.
Dr. Abdullah.
Dr. Taşgetiren.
Dr. Ömer. And Dr. Abdullah Al-Arian. I just have two more comments before we end. This has really been very illuminating, powerful presentations and conference, and it far exceeded my expectations. And I really want to thank the speakers for presenting these speeches and these presentations that shows their dedication to intellectual activity and their dedication to their field. So let's give them a round of applause for all the hard work they put in. And I also would like to remind you about this evening, 5 o'clock, there will be a public session with Doctors Tariq Ramadan and John Esposito, and I hope all of you can make it tonight. There will be buses from this campus, I believe. What time are they leaving? 4:45. 4:45 at the gate. We start at 5. It only takes about 10 minutes to get there. So I hope all of you will show up. It will be very good discussion tonight and good presentations. And finally, I would like to call Dr. Bulut to give some awards for our staff who worked very, very hard to get this conference in the way it is.
Okay. Let's say some words and
Okay. Can you start after or before? You want to say before?
at the end? After. Okay.
Dr. Ömer Özbek. Dr. Ömer is the General Secretary of Salah ad-Din Zaim University, and he worked very hard with us. All this organization that you see and the support we got from the university has always been due to Dr. Ömer. Now I'm going to call on our staff members in our center. Fadi Zatari. Dr. Muhammad Musa. Is he here? It's probably outside, so just put it here. Awais Khan.
That's all? Few words. That's enough. Yeah. Yeah.
I'll get you in a second. Just stay here. Amani Sinwar. All right, Professor Muhammad Musa. Mehmet Jabaji. The heart of our center, Yunus Akdeniz. And also Dr. Ömer Taşgetiren. What you see here is our staff who made this possible.
We forgot the last one, last but not least, and the most important. This is for Sami Al-Arian.
So what courses do you teach? Secularism, citizenship? Cities, oh yeah. Yeah. History of what? Thought. Western history or both?
You want to say a few words to the crowd?
Yeah.
So how are your students? Are they good students? Do they do
Again, thank you so much for being part of this. We'll have just final departing words from the president of Istanbul Saim University. After that, we'll go to lunch, and we'll see all of you tonight, inshallah, in the convention center. Dr. Bulut.
I just would like to thank to the organizers, first Sami Al-Arian again, and for his team. It's really a very big event and very good success. On behalf of my universe and all my team, I also would like to thank to all of you for participating and for your contributions. Thank you so much for all of you, and see you again here at ISO.